My name is Avianna Vyff, and this is my capstone project on video games and fluid intelligence. I've always been fascinated by neuroscience. Like when I was a kid, I used to play mad scientist and make potions of like milk and orange juice to give to my siblings to make them smarter, but clearly that didn't work. So now that I'm older and still very interested in neuroscience, I've been looking at ways that you can actually change the brain. So, first of all, how can we measure intelligence? According to Raymond Cattell, there are two factors to generalized IQ: crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence. So crystallized intelligence is essentially what you know and what you've learned over the course of your lifetime, whereas fluid intelligence is how you can apply that knowledge in new situations. So it's kind of like your on-the-spot reasoning skills, like how quickly you can come up with things. Crystallized intelligence increases over time as you learn things and get older. However, fluid intelligence, they used to think it was constant and you couldn't change it at all, but they now know that there are some things that can change it. And this is just a graph that's kind of interesting of how they change over time. So as you can see, as you get older, your crystallized intelligence increases, but your fluid intelligence decreases, which is from like age degeneration of the cerebellum. Yes, so this is a test of fluid IQ. So you don't really need to know anything to be able to answer this. All you need to be able to do is like look at it, so it doesn't rely upon prior knowledge. And so this is the correct answer, D. And there isn't really any way to explain how to do it. You just have to kind of be able to recognize the patterns and put together the next one. Yeah, so this is a test developed by psychologists to increase your fluid intelligence, and it's kind of difficult to explain, so bear with me. But the way it works is the subject will be presented with a series of images or letters or numbers, and you have to click if it matches. It's called in variable, so if it matches 1 back, then that's a 1 back test, and then 2 back would be like if it matches this one, and then 3 back would be if it matches that one, and then so on and so on. But they're presented one at a time, so you don't see them in a string like that. And so as it progressively gets more difficult and more numbers, it's supposed to increase your memory skills. And this is the dual impact, which is the same concept, but along with the visual stimuli, you also have sounds that you have to remember. So it's actually very difficult. I've played it, and it's a lot harder than it seems, but yeah. So current research has shown that games, in particular the in-back test, do have the capacity to increase our fluid intelligence. But there is some controversy over whether or not they actually increase fluid intelligence, or if they're just being habituated to the game, so over time they get better at playing it. Because all of the studies I looked at, the test of fluid intelligence was also the in-back test. So they would have them play it over long periods of time and then see if their score increased, but they didn't have them take other tests like IQ tests or anything of that sort. So another issue with the in-back game or test is that it is kind of complicated to grasp at first, and it's not very engaging, so people wouldn't be inclined to play it on their own. I don't think very many people want to sit there for like 2 hours just remembering pictures. So there are people who are looking at building more engaging games. And one example of that is Lumosity, which is a very popular website that advertises fun logic games. So what can I add? My idea was to test fluid intelligence change in the short term after subjects play different games. And I use games that are non-traditional, and they're things that people kind of play for fun, because that's what I wanted to look at. Like if these types of games would have any effect on fluid intelligence. I also did throw in the speedrun, which is the dual in-back test. It's a variant of it, but it ended up not working out, and I'll talk more about that later. So my null hypothesis was that the short-term playing of video games would not have a statistically significant effect. And the reason I thought that was because I couldn't actually find any studies that had done short-term testing. All of them were over months and months, but I felt it would be kind of difficult to get like 90 participants to agree to play these games for months and then like verify that they actually had been playing them and stuff. So yes, and my control group was no game. So I had a group of people who didn't play any game, and then I had groups that played Flappy Bird, Tetris, and Speedrun. So I selected participants by the snowball effect on Facebook, which is an actual statistics term, but all it means basically is that I sent it to someone and then asked them to send it to people and asked them to send it to other people. I had it on my website, a link to the games. And so I had around 95 responses, but because of the nature of my website, I programmed the HTML to like randomly give them one of 3 games. And because it was random, there weren't equal numbers of all of them, so I couldn't run tests on them unless they had the same amount. And the smallest group was 20, which I think was no game. And so I randomly selected 20 from the other populations. So the first game was Flappy Bird, of course. And the second game was Tetris. And then the most interesting game, I suppose, was Speedrun. So this is designed by psychologists. It's the same as the dual in-back. It actually has sounds that play that you can hear. And you're supposed to match the orientation of this little disc in the middle, and they come towards you. And this was actually an attempt to make the traditional in-back more fun or more engaging. But what I found is that people weren't completing it because on my website, eventually I had like a lot of responses from all of the other games, and I only had 2 from Speedrun. And so clearly that was not the way the math would have worked out. So I ended up having to drop it after 4 people completed it because I had many, many more from the other groups. So clearly people were starting it and then quitting before the end. And this was also shown to increase fluid intelligence in long-term trials. Yes, so the actual test, see if this works, was 13 questions on fluid intelligence that I put together from IQ tests that were pre-existing, because it's kind of hard to make IQ questions. But I got most of them from the Mensa website because they're copyright free. And so this is, I'll just flip through the question I showed as an example. I used only questions that tested fluid intelligence because on a traditional IQ test you have like an even mix of fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence, which would be like vocabulary questions and like vocab comparisons and stuff like that. But I specifically chose only fluid intelligence, which would be like pattern recognition, math skills. Math is actually fluid intelligence, but I thought that was interesting. It's considered to be fluid intelligence and not learned, but yes. So these are the results from the IQ test, and this is the average score for each group out of 13 people. So as you can see, it looks like Flappy Bird maybe did a little bit better and Tetris did slightly better than No Game, but there's not really any way to tell if that's a significant difference without running statistical analysis. So that's the fun part. So I ran an analysis of variance test, which analyzes the differences between group means. So if you have 2 groups of test scores, it will tell you if there's an actual statistically significant difference between them. But what it doesn't do is tell you which group is significant. So I ran this on all 3 of them, and it showed that there wasn't a significant difference. But if there had been, I would have gone back in and ran a t-test between each individual group to figure out which one was the outlier. But yes, conclusion, this is stat stuff, sorry, it's kind of like, my conclusion was that P is greater than alpha, which means there's no significant difference between the group score means. And this concept is kind of hard to understand, or at least I think it is, but P is, like in statistics, the probability that the results obtained were due to random chance, and alpha is the probability that you rejected your hypothesis when it was actually true. So what that means is that if P is greater than alpha, it's not significant. And if P is less than alpha, then there is a difference. It means that the results were not obtained by chance. These were the results for each individual question. So questions 1 through 13, and then each game, Tetris, Flappy Bird, and no game. So I ran a one sample t-test on each individual question, each column, to determine if there was any variance. Because what you would expect is that like each of these numbers would be the same, but they're not clearly. So I ran the test, and what this is showing is the probability that each of those columns was obtained due to random chance. So like this is just randomly a lot lower than that, and it doesn't actually mean anything. But what I found was that one of the questions, question 6, had a very, very small p-value, which means that the results were most likely not random. And I used Fisher's exact test because it's more useful for smaller sample sizes, but that doesn't mean much. So my conclusion was that P was less than alpha for one question. So question number 6 had a p-value below 0.05, which is generally considered the most rigorous value of alpha. Sometimes people use 0.1 or 0.2, but this is the strictest. So that suggests that the range of correct answers between the 3 experimental groups was not due to random chance. And what it showed was that Flappy Bird players did significantly better than players who played no game. And this is question 6. It is a math reasoning skills question. So, yes, the correct answer is 92.5. I didn't put that on there. But you have to be able to recognize that there are 2 different patterns interwoven, so it's actually like one pattern and then another pattern. So it's kind of difficult. But so my overall conclusions were that games did not affect the average test scores for each group, and they did not affect 12 of 13 questions. However, since there was the difference between scores on question 6, it suggests room for further study in that area. And prolonged game exposure could result in more significant results or different results, so that would be an interesting follow-up study to do also, and have them play the test for a long period of time. And so what does it mean? Since my results were mixed, there isn't a definite answer. But overall, I would say that I found no evidence of short-term fluid intelligence increase, except for the one question. So that raises questions as to the effects of casual games on fluid intelligence. And for future tests, I would like to look at a wider variety of casual games and see if any others affect question scores, and see if I could kind of group them by question type, because the people who played Flappy Bird did better on a math reasoning question, so I'm interested to see if that means anything, or if people who played different games would do better on like the shape recognition questions and things like that. So I think that's all. Thank you.
This goes along kind of with your, the very last thing that you said, but if you had just like a magical time where you had with as much time as you wanted and as many participants and as much money, what would that time be, and what would you do?
Well, I would ideally, like, if I could force people to play the game for like a year, I would have, first of all, a lot more test subjects. Although I obtained like a decent amount, I think. You need over 30 typically in statistics. But yeah, I would have hundreds, because I feel like...
What age range and what education range?
See, that's interesting. Actually, in my test, the average age was older than I was expecting it to be. It was around 30, I think, because a lot of the people who shared it through Facebook were like my dad's colleagues because he works in, he used to work in a media lab, so yeah. But I think if I could control that, I would probably have one group of younger people, like maybe in their 20s, and then a group of older people, like 70s. I don't know. I think that would be interesting to look at the difference because of how fluid intelligence declines over time. But
could you elaborate a little bit more on how the tests actually went? So you're saying you had a website?
yes. I can demonstrate. I programmed the HTML on a page on my dad's website so that it would randomly send you to one of 3 links. And, well, originally it was 4, but then I had to drop the speed run. And so, sorry. And so when you clicked on the link, it would send you to one of 3 games. And there were instructions at the top of the page, like detailing what to do. And then the site was set on a timer, so after 3 minutes ran out, like the game would disappear, and it would be a link to the Fluid IQ test.
Excellent.
And then when you clicked on that, it would take you to the test I showed. And yeah.
Do you have any ideas why Flappy Bird was particularly enhancing for the math skills?
I don't. It's actually a very interesting question because Flappy Bird is not very, I mean, it's not like a logic game. It's kind of mindless. I mean, I could make,
I never played Flappy Bird, I just knew Tetris.
it's like, what's the picture? Basically, you just click on the screen and the bird bounces up and down and you try to like get through these pipes as it goes across the screen. If I had to make a random guess, I might guess that like I've played it and I felt very frustrated when I played it, so that like increased my heart rate and adrenaline, and I feel like maybe people's brains are more acute when they're like frustrated. I'm not really sure, but that would just be my guess.
Yeah. How much knowledge did you have of the statistical methods you implemented? How much of that knowledge do you have beforehand, and what do you have to pick up?
Well, I took AP Stats last year, so I had a lot of statistical knowledge, but I did have to go like reread things.
Yeah.
'Cause there's a lot to remember, but
You know more about stats than I do. And I just took it.
I like stats.
Or I might just not even pay attention to class.
When you were doing your research, when I see some of these games, I'm like, that has to decrease your intelligence. Like,
Yeah.
that is such a silly game. Did you come across any like research where like fluid intelligence was actually like hindered because of exposure to technology or these apps that are coming out or anything like that?
I actually didn't. All of the research that I saw was looking at like how it can increase things. One thing I did see, that this was an increase in ability, but there were a bunch of tests looking at like Xbox games like Call of Duty and Mass Effect and things, and they actually showed that over time they do increase your reaction time and then also your mental reaction time. So they had people take like quick math tests, and they didn't look at how many they got right, they just looked at how far they got in a certain amount of time, and like after playing first-person shooters for a long time, they actually like got through more of them, which is weird. Like, it's crazy, yeah.
How much computer programming did you learn? Did you have
I took
HTML knowledge?
AP Comp Sci sophomore year, so I
Got it.
yeah,
Excellent.
past experience.
So I have a question, just kind of like from an educator standpoint.
Mhm.
You know, you talked in the beginning about crystallized intelligence versus fluid intelligence, and how, you know, crystallized intelligence is what we can learn over time. And so as educators, clearly that's the nature of our game, that's the nature of our beast, right? We're constantly trying to give students more so that they can have a wider base of knowledge. Should we be thinking about how to implement more activities, curricula that increase or enhance, or at least help us consider and find out how to improve fluid intelligence, so that kids don't have to constantly go to video games to get all of their mental sharpening in terms of reaction time? Like, I think that'd be kind of interesting to know about.
Yeah, I think there should be. I feel like logic and reasoning skills are very important. And there was actually one study I looked at, which was more of just like a survey than an experiment, but they found that as schools, they were looking at schools as a whole, as their average test scores increase, like SAT and state standardized testing, their fluid intelligence skills do not. So it's actually the same for a school that has like an average SAT score of 2100, which would be insane, but like versus a school that has like an average of 1200. Yeah. So.
What were some big challenges in terms of your project that, like, you weren't expecting going in, but then you ended up having to overcome?
I feel like programming the website took a lot of time, and I had originally wanted to record their scores on the games too,
Yeah.
so I could have that data, but I just couldn't figure out a way to do that through the website. I would have to have them self-report, and I figured that wouldn't be reliable, so that was like not ideal, but because I thought it would be interesting. I wanted to also look at like how their performance on the games related to their performance on the IQ test, but.
And to clarify, the games they were on, they did it on computer.
Yes.
Do you think the device matters at all, or is there research that talks about that, whether you do it on a computer, iPad, a phone?
I actually didn't come across any research that looked into that. That's interesting, but yeah, I'm not sure if it makes a difference.
I have a question for you, Abby.
Yeah.
So you said that you shared it with some people, who then hopefully shared it with some people, who hopefully shared it with some people, and then, so it was just the link to your website?
Yes.
That was that was pretty much, so when they click on that link to your website, do they know that they're about to take a test that is designed to evaluate their fluid intelligence? Or is it more just kind of like, ooh, here's a test, let's try it? And then, you know, you're going into the test truly blind versus understanding what you're trying to accomplish.
I did not, this is just an example of like the game page. And if you reload it, it gives you different games. It's the speedrun. I put it back up after the experiment was over. But this is no game. I originally in the instructions said something about it being a fluid reasoning test, but I didn't detail it that much because I didn't want to like prime them much. But I think I just said like do your best, and I mean it's called fluid reasoning test, but I did not explain what that meant to any of the participants. So I feel like it was more of a blind test because I didn't send out any information like this is fluid intelligence. I mean they could have Googled it, but I think it was a blind test.
What is interesting is I
Yeah.
on your test obviously at one point just trying to see what it was, and I didn't know that you could have had multiple games that you could play, so I got the no test option.
Yeah.
And I know how you talked about like people who play Flappy Bird get their heart rate and their frustration kind of like grows
Mhm.
initially. So it was the test itself that made my frustration grow, and so I just kind of started clicking things.
Yeah.
And getting really angry. I'm like, I must not have any fluid intelligence, so I was mad. And my score was probably something really terrible. But,
Yeah.
you know, I wondered like,
No.
thank you for validating.
Oh, that reminds me. I still need to I'm sending explanations of the scores to everyone who took it, so I'm going to do that this weekend. But
Maybe skip this.
I already knew.
I forgot to mention I didn't tell anyone that there were multiple games before they took the test, and so no one really knew like what they were getting to when they clicked on the link. It just says like click this link and follow the instructions. So like a lot of people didn't know that there were multiple games. So yeah, unless they like refresh the page a bunch. But yeah.